The discussion for a remake of the Crash Bandicoot trilogy has been talked about as far back as the PlayStation 3, with the rise of HD remakes for various series. What was once known as one of the big faces of mascot platformers, the Crash games became less recognisable with each entry after the ownership under Naughty Dog ended in 1999. From then on, the Crash brand has been passed on to multiple publishers and developers, the first being Eurocom with Crash Bash, Traveller's Tales with The Wrath of Cortex and Twinsanity, Radical Entertainment with Tag Team Racing, Crash of the Titans and Mind Over Mutant, Dimps with Crash Bing Bang, and finally Polarbit with a number of touchscreen phone games. Despite having a steady flow of titles coming out from these developers, as the years went on, general interest with the Orange Marsupial became less enthusiastic, but rumours of a Crash Trilogy HD remake was always in the air under a what-if scenario. After Activision bought the rights to Crash in 2008, this series eventually vanished into obscurity. For years, no title would be announced, with the occasional instance of speculation being sparked up by rumours of Sony buying back the rights from Activision, co-creator Andy Gavin suggesting ways of revitalising the series by either a reboot or a remake of the first 4 games. Even the boulder level from Crash 1 was playable as a nod to their former series in Uncharted 4, reinforcing more speculation of his return. Not to mention SCEA President Sean Layden wearing a Crash t-shirt at the PlayStation Experience in 2015, making a potentially subliminal message for the return of a series. But after years of waiting, hoping and online rumours, it would be revealed at E3 2016 that Crash was in fact making a comeback to the sound of rapturous applause.
I'm proud to announce that we work with our partners at Activision who are going to bring back the original Crash, Crash 2, and Crash Warped, fully remastered from the ground up for PlayStation 4.
This would be followed by multiple updates in the passing months via trailers, gameplay demos and comparisons between the remake and its predecessor. Whilst the coverage was more than welcomed by many, concerns for how the game would turn out became more of a growing concern for some, including myself. Whilst the existence of these levels being shown in motion was satisfying, I couldn't help but feel that they looked brighter than the original and lacking textured details in the environments. The way Crash moved in the gameplay footage led to my biggest concern being the controls and if they were able to retain every little nuance in Crash's moveset and not feel floaty in a similar vein to Little Big Planet. But knowing that Vicarious Visions are at the helm, it did make me more hopeful with its eventual release. These are the guys that have previously developed the Crash games on the Game Boy Advance and Crash Nitro Kart, so this wasn't being made by yet another different development team, rather one that's had some experience with the series and made some well-received entries for that matter. But like many of you watching, the PS1 Crashes played a major role whilst growing up with video games and hold a lot of nostalgic value to me on a personal level. I still play through these games once a year because I love them so much, so a remake to 3 of the most influential games in my life certainly made me feel anxious to how these turn out, regardless of whoever made them. Since this is a remake, I will be making comparisons between the Sane Trilogy and the originals throughout the entire review. I've previously covered the first 3 titles on this channel, so I would highly recommend watching that video before continuing with this one, as I will be referring to opinions and criticisms I've had with the originals. It's in a different style to how I do videos these days, but they're still the same opinions that I share with the games today. So with that being said, let's get started. The closest thing that comes to mind when talking about the structure is that it's essentially this generation's Super Mario All-Stars, with a selection of the first few titles that can be played in any order with a graphical upgrade and higher quality music. But what makes this one different to most remakes or remasters that we've seen in the last decade is that it's been completely built from the ground up due to the source code not being available to the team to set its foundation upon. Thankfully, the level geometry from the originals were still around and used as a reference. Everything else, however, including the data for the animations, textures, control timing and the AI, were all gone. So this means other aspects had to be made from scratch, including modern lighting techniques used in their Alchemy engine to create realistic lighting effects in contrast to Naughty Dog's coloured textures that made an illusion of dynamic lighting, giving the originals an overall darker aesthetic. This isn't simply a boost in resolution with added trophy support to appeal to modern players, but rather a complete overhaul to all 3 games that tries to blend the classic vibes with contemporary technology. Instead of think of it the same way as the HD remasters we saw on the Xbox 360 or PlayStation 3, think of the Sane Trilogy to the likes of Metroid Zero Mission or Metal Gear Solid The Twin Snakes, games that completely make a brand new version of a game and putting in tweaks to the gameplay to iron out any criticisms that occurred in the past. But with this it seems that they've attempted to improve aspects of the free crashes whilst at the same time retaining the original experience with a number of exploits kept in, each of which removing previous problems but in the long run creating some new glaring issues. The cutscenes were one of my favourite things in the original trilogy, and in this it's no different, with each opening and closing cutscene recreated, adding more artistic flair and expression from each character on screen. Before, the cutscenes were made with the in-game engine on board with the same graphical limitations used in the main game. I still don't have a problem with these since they tell the player the premise of the plot, and in my opinion they've aged pretty well compared to other games of that time without resorting to the use of early CG FMVs. But after seeing these, it does nothing short but add more to what was already shown over 20 years ago. Even though they use the same lines of dialogue, they've still done their best by making them more expressive by adding different shots and alternate cuts to get better reactions between characters. Even adding in extra details like Torna fighting off the lab assistants in the first one, making her look less of a generic damsel in distress archetype, Cortex breaking the fourth wall with his devilish intentions, and demonstrating how the time twister works just adds to the experience of that we're about to play a very cartoonish platformer. A minor detail I like is that they show how Crash and Coco got into the time twister in the first place, which always irks the back of my mind for some reason. The voice acting isn't delivered by the original cast, but instead provided by those who played their roles in previous entries, mainly from Crash of the Titans and Mind Over Mutants. I like that they didn't try to recreate what the original cast did, and instead perform their own interpretations of how these characters would say these lines. This does mean that some of the voice acting didn't quite resonate with me 100% of the time, but it all comes down to taste. It's not awful by any means. The added details of cartoon eyes in a darkened room, the manic expressions of Cortex's assistants, and even the choice of perspectives in its shots are all creative decisions that I enjoyed expanding on the cartoony nature of the series. As much as I liked all of the cutscenes, the only choices I couldn't understand was, despite how much they got right about adding more character to Crash, Coco and their antagonists, the air of the mysterious and sinister are absent, as they show Uka Uka fully lit in front of Cortex in the opening cutscene to Crash 3. Such a minor change can make a big difference to the atmosphere darkness can give to a new character for the series, as evil as Uka Uka is. In the original you saw nothing but his outline, mouth and the glowing eyes seep in the shadow-drenched mask, floating ominously, only making him more of a threat to Crash and the gang. Fast forward to 2017 and we see this at the time new villain fully animated with a variety of facial expressions, including some of which remove his intimidating nature completely. I know it's not a horror game to create suspense for the player, but to children who might be playing this for the first time, I feel that there's a minor aspect lost in translation upon remaking the game. When I was a kid and played this for the first time, I thought it was cool not only that Cortex had a mask of his own, but also it was one so evil that it wouldn't show its face until later on, adding to the anonymous impression this villain had upon me. The same can be said for Entropy's reveal. When Uka Uka is lecturing Cortex, we see a silhouette of something standing in the background that we then see him briskly walking towards the forefront, making his grand entrance. Whereas in the remake, a portal opens and Entropy steps out and stands there looking a little bit smug with himself. This is all going to come down to preference, and this didn't make me roll with my eyes by how terribly they've recreated this scene. I just prefer the original as it makes a better impression of how intimidating these new villains are. The voice acting from John DiMaggio in this remake is brilliant, almost making up for the lack of darkness by making Uka Uka sound more furious and exaggerating his words at Cortex.
I sent you simple instructions to follow, but you lost the gems, you lost the crystals, and I have lost my patience.
But having Entropy popping out of the portal and stand there doesn't really do anything for me. Also, Uka Uka smiling simply doesn't fit his persona, rather being there to stick to a more family-friendly animated movie style we see in the Sane Trilogy. Of course, the minor changes that occurred in the cutscenes isn't going to be an issue with most people, and the ones I brought up will come down to preference. All these differences aside, the quality of animation during gameplay retains the quirky quality that we've seen in the series for the most part. During development on the first Crash, creators Jason Rubin and Andy Gavin aspired to replicate the animation quality of Disney and Looney Tunes cartoons by going out of their way by inventing some ambitious assembly language vertex compressors to be stored into every vertex at every frame that ran at 30 frames per second. This allowed for more joints to be played around with instead of a simple skeleton with one joint waiting that was often used by developers at that time. As you may have guessed during the early days of the PlayStation, it was a challenge to say the least, and after multiple attempts by Ruben and Gavin, their associate Mark Cerny came up with the best working language that would later be used on the animations of the original game. Despite the complex workaround and limited amount of polygons they had to play with, Naughty Dog managed to convey the Saturday morning cartoon feel that they were going for. With the advantage of modern day technology, Vicarious Visions are able to add more definition and detail to every character and enemy across all 3 games. Everything has a more bouncy feel when looking at enemies' walking cycles, exaggerating their movements, and it gives them a bit more character rather than them being single-pathed enemies going in one direction, turning around and back the other way. Or when they get jumped on, instead of disappearing in a puff of smoke, they usually squash down and comically have their eyes bulging out for a split second. They've sometimes gone one step further and gave faces to enemies that didn't have them before, reinforcing that everything in this world had their own personality, as one-dimensional as it might be. Crash's moves are retained in this remake, from spinning and jumping to sliding and crawling with his rear end up in the air. But like the enemies in the trilogy, he's been given more personality in the form of more facial expressions in certain situations, such as running away from a boulder, slowly coming to a halt whilst he's on ice, or being grossed out by these big puddles of mud whilst keeping his hands from touching it. Even though he has these kinds of animations in Crash 2 and 3, the Sane Trilogy does a good enough job at either replicating or altering these added bits of detail, as well as his idle animations. It's a shame that not every animation returns, most notably the death animation that Crash made in the first game, but in context with the other 2, I can understand why it isn't there, but it would have been another nice touch for the game. A bit of an odd omission is that they've taken away Crash's thrusting from his dance whenever he beats a level, so he runs on the spot instead. I guess they didn't want anything risque in front of the children. Coco's appearance as a playable character for the majority of the time has their own set of animations to boot, but I think they held back on the death animation somewhat. Most of the time we see her turning into a ghostly angel instead of being squashed or slammed into the ground like her brother does. I think this was intentional from the developers to keep her more modest, as she's known to be the smarter one of the 2, but that's not to say that she's completely stern, as she does have her own dance whenever you get an item, but alas, no thrusting. Something a little bit more substantial is how they've given a number of enemies and obstacles certain telegraphs indicating they're about to do something. A few of these I found is how the man-eating lily pads tense up their jaws and make a noise before committing to a bite, or their spears poke out a little bit before thrusting out their full length, as well as the slamming tree trunks in Snow Go. It might not be something you'll notice at first, but I'm sure there are more examples of this elsewhere. The animation quality of the cutscenes can also be found with the in-game cutscenes in Crash 2 and 3, when you're in the warp room or having the bad guys talk to you at certain points of the game. Just like with the cutscenes, the advances of modern tech are on display as we see each character exuding more personality than their predecessors. Subtle nods are included here too, like Entropy's face being more kind and talking about Uka Uka, only then to be brought back down when he mentions Cortex's name. Or how Engine's head is all over the place so much that his dislodged missile actually swings in momentum once he stops. But my personal favourite has to be Embryo's unhinged hologram message in Crash 2, where the animators went out to expand his skittish tendencies to full on, making him look like a raving lunatic, making his original counterpart look tame in comparison. It can't be said that every boss has been given as much care and attention, but I can say they did their best to retain their charm, but sadly a few cut corners can be seen in some of these fights. Like how Crash looks like he's been dragged and dropped to use Papu's belly as a trampoline, and the same can be said for Pinstripe's jumping. Admittedly, these are nitpicks and it doesn't matter completely, but it does show that this project may have been rushed or not as well budgeted as one would like to imagine. One of the telltale signs of this can be seen more vividly lies in certain levels of the trilogy. Whether you're playing the Arctic ventures down the wintry chasms or Coco riding down the mid-construction Great Wall of China, the animal riding altar-scrollers have been a hallmark to the series that further lends itself into the cartoony roots where the game's inspirations came from. And whilst the remake does an impressive job at recreating the hog levels from Crash 1, complete with Crash swaying from side to side each time you make a maneuver, the latter games seem to have fallen short in terms of polish. Polar and Purr look as though they glide along every time you turn, which always caught my eye for some reason. They do this as well in the original games, but I've only ever noticed this when I was playing the Sane Trilogy and looking out for it. Maybe it's because this is in widescreen or the camera is slightly closer to the characters, but for me it does stand out even though I should be paying attention to the level. Everything else though, from the dragons flying in to the killer whales leaping from the icy water, is animated to the same quality to the rest of the collection. The impression I got after playing this game in regards to art style, I think they attempted to combine the look of the original trilogy with the cartoony elements from later entries with a light layer of realistic physics and lighting effects. I'm always open to an alternative tweak to an established style, but this has left me on the fence overall. Every now and then you've probably seen a video or two of someone who's recreated a level of a game in the Unreal Engine, and they normally look stunning with the fidelity of modern graphics, and as wonderful as it is to look at first, it is ultimately a demonstration on how far graphics have come since then. And I feel like when I play certain levels like Toad Village, it reminds me of these videos. The grass being fully rendered along with the realistic water-based physics and the sun in the sky all technically feel beautiful in its own right, but the issue I have is how in turn it's taken something away from the visuals that this series was known for. It's not exclusive to the medieval levels either. Playing through the games made me realise how washed out they look overall in comparison to their original counterparts. That isn't to say it's an ugly game by any means. The environments still pack a bright and colourful punch, and the attention to retaining specific details lends to the passion that the developers had when making them. The paintings on Pinstripe's stage have been taken right out of the original and scaled up to support modern day resolutions, which you can finally see what that sketch is saying on the floor. It's obvious that there's some subtle guidance scattered throughout the trilogy in a bid to help younger players out, or as a means to counter certain depth perception issues, like adding cracks to the floor in the latter half of Toxic Waste, and adding skulls to the fur of skunks. They've even put in other details to add some logic to why the lab assistant's hands are sparkling by giving them electrified gloves, and Crash actually throwing Wumpa Fruit at Engine instead of him magically coming out of his body. And most importantly, Tiny finally being given some visible stripes. If you're playing the PlayStation 4 version, there's some nice nods to Naughty Dog, like a photo of Nathan Drake on the mantelpiece in the opening to Crash 3, Coco in the middle of watching the cutscene from Uncharted 4 where Drake is playing Crash 1 before a laptop runs out flat at the start of Crash 2. Where there's a small triumph in replicating the look of the games as unnoticeable as they might be, there's usually more flaws to find here. Coming back to the Unreal demos, as good as they are to look at, I'm sure the creators of those demos would use them as a basis to recapture the essence of how the original games looked, contributing to the overall experience by scaling back on the scope or adding in more vibrant colours. If these were to be the final product, I'm sure there would be a group that would always have a thought in the back of their heads wondering if more could have been done, and that's how I kept feeling whilst playing the Sane Trilogy. The level structure, the enemy placement, the added enhancements to make the first game feel more streamlined with the other two, the elements are all there, and yet something is missing. Some levels do have a nice balance between realism and the cartoonish, like the temple levels where the chunky stone blocks are still there and the brightly coloured snakes and spiders creeping in, but despite the walls and additional statues being visible, you still get that sense of seclusion, thanks to the seemingly bottomless pitch black that crawls beneath you throughout the level, not to mention the light mist and makes it feel like you're jumping and spinning your way through a long forgotten structure. Road to Nowhere shares this equal weight in styles. Whilst admittedly being less foggy than the original, the stalagmite-like formations are more defined whilst the clouds underneath are more pronounced, giving the impression that Crash is still high up, with a bottomless chasm hanging underneath. Also, the planks of flimsy wood are suitably exaggerated, and not just one-sided textures dangling in mid-air. However, more levels suffer than the ones that benefit from this makeover, making them less substantial to look at, or at worst, completely changing the feel of a level and missing the essence of its setting. And even though the levels just mentioned have their positives, they do share the same problem with the majority of the games. Almost everything looks too bright, making levels look washed out in comparison, and despite all the added details to the textures and environments, it ends up making the levels look sanitized. Some might say that because of the limitations that the PlayStation had, the jagged edges and low-res textures that's synonymous with early 3D graphics can be a factor to Crash's rugged look, but I'd like to argue that whilst the limitations are present throughout the trilogy, the artistic direction has always been upfront through its bright colours, exaggerated enemy design, and characterised animations. So to see a platformer that was inspired by Looney Tunes cartoons being remade using realistic textures and lighting feels more at home being compared to a Looney Tunes knockoff, or one of those awkward looking live action movies with the characters from the early 2000s. The warp room in Crash 2 is where the stark difference becomes apparent from the moment you enter it. It's fully lit and the walls look plain and lacking the wear and tear that the original had, and it only gets worse when a hologram appears. In the original, the warp room darkens like a movie theatre for the projection to start rolling. The amount of static and interference that plays gives you an idea that you're far underground. The occasional lens flare certainly adds to the grounded nature that these games had, which relates to the painful sounds that are used to make Crash's deaths more extreme. I know it's a small aspect of the game, but it says so much by how much detail Naughty Dog went in order to make their worlds more engaging. Turn to the Sane Trilogy, and nearly everything about what made those cutscenes special are gone. Before the update, there was no change to the lighting when a message began to roll, making it look flat and bland. It looks a bit better now, but not by much, with them just adding a black mist in the background and changing nothing else. The animation and voice acting is still top notch, but hindered by how little has been put into everything else. There's no static, no additional sound effects, or even moments of the image quality shifting between noisy and harsh to smooth in regular intervals. Instead of enhancing what the original had delivered over 2 decades ago, it takes something away which is puzzling. Sure, Coco's messages still have that interfering element, but it never felt unstable like it was her hacking away through Cortex's signal. Instead it looks formulaic, with the characters finishing their lines to go back to their default position and move on to the next character. Coco interrupts Cortex's message in mid-sentence, fading into Warm Crash, only to get cut out with more interference.
Enough to rip the Earth apart. Properly utilized, however, the crystals can absorb and contain the energy.
Crash, is that you? I've been looking everywhere. I don't have much time to tell you this. You have to be careful. Trusting Cortex seems a little unwise. Crash, I can't keep the data path open this longer. Crash, you need...
Yet in the remake, Cortex actually finishes a sentence before Coco interrupts him to warn Crash, and having a little more than a sound effect to show that she's breaking up.
Great enough to rip the Earth apart. Properly utilized, however, the crystals can absorb and contain the energy.
Crash, is that you? I've been looking everywhere. I don't have much time to tell you this. You have to be careful. Trusting Cortex seems a little unwise, Crash. I can't keep the data path open much longer. Crash, you need to...
With all the advances of modern tech, it's baffling to how this was missed out, especially how great the opening and closing cutscenes looked. And whilst I'm on the subject of missing the mark for contextual settings, what on earth happened to Slippery Climb? The original had an intimidating atmosphere by the hazy looking brick walls, the intense rain and its drops falling off the edge of every platform in sight. Instead we see once again an all-round cleaner look to the walls, and the rain toned down to faint raindrops and windows glowing with inviting warm golds and yellows. It's well established that Slippery Climb is infamous for its difficulty, and I think Naughty Dog knew that after designing the layout while making the level look intimidating to the player. I sincerely hope it isn't this, but I imagine that these minor changes in tone to some of these levels were made to cater to a younger audience, and if that really is the case, that's just patronising. Remember those creepy looking hands clawing out of the holes in the levels with green demonic eyes? Well, now it's some old man with a long beard. Fits in with the animal prisoner aspect, I guess. Not only has the overall look and colour palette has been sacrificed for a softer approach to its appearance, but the music has changed the feeling even further by adding whistles and a rotary organ that ends up making it sound like a Mexican carnival. Whereas the original composition had a daunting nature that opens up with strange ambient sounds led on by a marching drum roll every now and then, laid by a dissonant bass line, reverbed clicks in the distance, and the melody being played by what sounds like a plucked violin strings, reinforcing the amount of caution the player must take whilst playing through this level. It also lends to how isolated Crash is at this point, and to some representing the beginning of the final stretch of the game. Another point that may back up this argument on younger audiences featuring Generator Room, where the monitors scattered throughout the level present a series of frames of Cortex looking at the camera. Again, I admit this is severely minuscule to the overall game, but in comparison to the original strange looking Cortex swinging back and forth under a green glow, it takes away the intimidating aesthetic that this level once had. It seems that the developers have replaced the light bulbs too, since everything is now fully lit to the point that nothing is left to the imagination. It just looks like a black room with a bunch of floating platforms and monitors playing a choppy GIF they found on Google Images. It's not like they've made other levels significantly brighter than their predecessors like Lights Out or Road to Ruin, so it begs the question as to why they chose to make it look unnecessarily bright for others. The Boulder levels are another example of this clash between cartoony influence and realistically based lighting. It's meant to be set deep within the jungles, so we get high contrasting shadows playing up to the limited resources that was already pushed in the hardware. It's slightly darker than the average jungle levels, so when you're running under a tunnel, it's significantly bathed in that familiar exaggeration of shadows in cartoons. The Insane Trilogy kinda does this to an extent, but there's some kind of haziness to the overall look, and the border itself looks rather pristine for something that's meant to be an ancient booby trap. The more I switch between footage of the original trilogy and its remake, the more I notice a stark difference in contrast and saturation, and perhaps it might not be that the fault of the designers themselves, because nearly everything has been brought back in excruciating detail and kept to their original look. But rather, it might have something to do with the technology itself that can't quite replicate the way Naughty Dog presented these levels back then. Admittedly, the majority of levels still pack a colourful punch and certainly caters to the overall aesthetic of the Crash games, but when you compare them to their original counterparts, the difference is almost night and day in terms of contrast and colour. Yes, the graphics have a higher resolution, yes there is more detail in the background, and yes there are more post-production effects, but it lacks those sharp edges, those definitive regions of danger and safety. I'm probably talking a load of bollocks and I might be wearing my rose-tinted glasses too much, but there is a quality that is lost in translation to this new version. The majority of surfaces look really clean, where it almost looks like it was made out of plasticine, like the grand walls of the Great Gate. It doesn't feel as believable that I'm running away atop ancient ruins in the dead of night when the stones look polished. Even the mid-construction of Orient Express share this, even though it would have grit or some cracks here and there on the floor, and I know this is such a ridiculous thing to whine over, but if some 20-year-old game can present the idea that these are old places for platforming across better than a modern day remake can, it's not gonna go unnoticed. But if we're gonna get really picky with presentation, then I could talk about how bad some of the water looks. It looks fine with Coco's jet skiing levels thankfully, with some nice reflections from the tropical sun, making it very tantalising to take a dip. But then you see Tomb Raider where the water goes up and down periodically, and it looks like it's fading in and out of existence. But in Crash 3, not only does it look reflective, but also when it's drained, there's a shallow amount of the stuff left telling the player that this is a very dangerous part of the level. But at least they kept the water stains on the wall, so it's not like they've completely removed that bit of detail. An oddity that again is small but hasn't gone unnoticed is that they've used a different font, even though you can download more accurately imitating fonts to your PC. Maybe they weren't able to use it due to legal reasons, or that the code is lost or whatever, but I imagine they did their best to impersonate the iconic typeface. It's not bad by any means, it's just something I noticed and kind of bugged me at first, but doesn't anymore. As critical as I have been with the look of the levels by how dull or bright they can look in comparison, that doesn't mean it's an ugly looking game. When looking at it by itself, there's still a lot of visual goodness to be taken away by this collection. I've always loved the sewer levels in Crash 2, from the dank ceilings and the colours bouncing off the drain pipes surrounding Crash, and I feel they pulled it off pretty well here as well. Sure, the surfaces look cleaner than I'd liked it to, but with how much they get right, I can overlook it. The enemy designs have some creative license, but it's exactly how I imagined them in a remake like this. The motorcycle levels from Crash 3 are accurately replicated too, my favourite of them being orange asphalt with its wide shadows and setting sun. One of the first levels I remember standing out to me in the remake were levels like Hang 8, where it captured my initial excitement of how faithful it looked, from the man-eating plants to the motorised mines. But you can also see wear and tear in the guise of algae draped over the platforms and cracks, accompanying them too. The underwater levels could have benefited from some more vibrancy in the colour palette, but the look of the enemies and the environmental elements are lovely. My only complaint would be the electrical spinny disc of death could look a bit more threatening by making the dome a bit more angular and darker, but it still does the job. There are others as well, but I'd be ending up listing off all the ones that I like, and considering how long this video is already, I'd rather not bore you with that. Everybody has their favourites, and if the look of the levels that I'm not keen on work for you, then who am I to judge? They're still great levels anyway. Well, maybe except for the plane levels. The original Crash Bandicoot is a good 3D platformer, but it isn't without its shortcomings. One of my criticisms with the game was how in order to save your progress, you would either have to complete a bonus round that would only occur on a selected number of levels, or earn a gem by destroying every box of the level. What made it more irritating was in the bonus rounds you were given only one chance at getting to the other end. As the game progresses, the more elaborate these bonus rounds would become, and to receive a gem, you had not only to break every box, but also doing it without dying once. This is one of the main reasons why the first Crash Bandicoot would be recommended to be played back after either playing through Crash 2 and 3, but in the Insane Trilogy, this and a whole lot more has been fixed. There's a level of consistency in this remake in regards to saving your game and making progress. You can save at any point in the hub worlds by pressing L2, and even have the option for an autosave feature. The bonus rounds act more similar to the sequels by giving you as many chances to beat them, including extra information on the bottom of the screen. Another nice touch in these rounds is when you get to the end, Cortex swoops in to take Tawna away from Crash, which actually clears up as to why she was standing there in the first place. Collecting gems is a similar affair where you can die but still receive a gem so long as you break every crate in that stage. But some of that difficulty still returns whether the original rules apply exclusively to the colour gems, which means levels such as the Lost City, Lights Out and the Lab should be just as difficult to traverse like before, but keep in mind that if you fail at any of these levels bonus rounds, it doesn't count as a death. Controlling Crash by today's standards can feel somewhat loose, as he usually has a sense of momentum when landing on platforms or spinning into crates, which can make certain sections more difficult than they ought to. This can be exacerbated by those who have become more accustomed to the analog sticks, as the original Crash predates a DualShock controller, meaning you can only play with the directional buttons. But thanks to the remake, you can now control him with the analog sticks like you could with 2 and 3, although I did find myself just using him with the directional buttons since the level layout is very similar to a 2D platformer. They've even tightened up his movement so that there's no longer any sense of slight momentum when you're playing, which makes levels with tighter platforming all the more easier. In theory. I'd like to imagine that in an ideal world where Naughty Dog still own the rights to the Crash franchise and were to hypothetically remake their own trilogy, I feel that they would have made most or perhaps all of these changes to keep with their first game more in line with the rest of the series. Having all 3 titles designed in a way to cohesively work off each other without needing the consideration of which order to play makes the first game feel more at home with the series instead of it being the other one alongside 2 and 3. There's no denying that its sequels raised the bar in nearly all aspects, but I can't help but admire how much Vicarious Visions have strived to make the original feel more relevant with the other 2. A great addition is that they've brought back one of the previously scrapped levels from Crash Bandicoot as DLC in the form of Stormy Ascent, essentially a more advanced version of Slippery Climb with an extended length, more obstacles and deceptive design. What's also cool is that if you download it, it gives you the ability to warp from the very start of the map all the way to the highest reaches of the 3rd island, which comes as handy when you're wanting to get from level to level quickly in a bid to earning that platinum trophy. On top of that, they've implemented time trials into 1 and 2, which makes sense since Crash 3 had it back in the day. On Warp's part, the placement of each time crate has been kept with their respective time values intact, with the formula being carried over to its predecessors, complete with the relic tiers of Sapphire, Gold and Platinum. Nothing has been changed that much, and the inclusion with the other 2 will seem odd at first, but after the umpteenth attempt at getting that platinum time, you'll always find ways of exploiting the game's collision and jump mechanics to your advantage, which was always part of the appeal. And since the trilogy has entered the 21st century, online leaderboards make some mandatory appearances as well as time comparisons between you players on your friends list and others from around the world, with times that make you wonder how on earth they got that time so damn low. There's not a lot else that can be said about this, but I think what would have made it more competitive would be the ability to race alongside your friends' ghosts, or have the target time above the clock so you can keep track on how well you're doing. One thing I did find a little bit confusing was upon defeating Cortex in Crash 2, you gain the running shoes ability as seen in Warped, but you don't get it in Crash 1. This could be due to the inconsistent lengths of the levels, where some would feel like a marathon like Native Fortress, and to some would perhaps end in less than a minute like Boulders. I'd like to think they tried giving Crash 1 this ability, but soon realised that they made the number of levels significantly shorter and perhaps less fun in the process, but who knows. I would have liked it if they stuck with the cohesive theme they've gone with by giving all 3 games the same treatment in terms of features. Regardless, it still offers an addictive yet slightly different challenge that relies more on precision rather than speed. Whilst the early Crash titles are known for their cartoonist design and simple but fun gameplay, it's fair to say that they weren't regarded as precision platformers, especially in the first one. Playing the first game all these years later, there's certainly a form of latency and looseness to how Crash feels when controlling him. You've probably heard of the phrase game feel, something that exists in every video game, and it's often a derogatory term used to describe what it's like to control something. Game feel is something that any player can detect without realising it. It's how long you can perform a complete halt after running at full speed. It's how satisfying it is to reload your shotgun after taking care of some ravenous baddies. It's how far you can jump, but how much you can control your trajectory whilst you're in midair. All of these things and more come down to the hidden art of game feel, and it's something that governs the overall quality of a game's control. You don't have to be a developer to understand what makes good or bad game feel, and in some, if not most cases, it can be stripped down to subjectivity on what the player expects for the game to control like. In a fighting game, for example, you'd expect every button press to have a lightning fast response to your input in order to perform those tricky combos. Whereas in a walking simulator, you'd expect your movement to feel a bit passive and weighted in order to take in your surroundings and give enough time to inspect anything that catches your eye. And in a platformer, it's normally expected for you to be in complete control of your character and be able to dictate which direction you want to go, so long as you don't hit any enemies or fall down any pitfalls. Admittedly, this is a very watered down exploration of what game feel is, and I'm not even going to go over the other important aspect of game feel, presentation, since there are plenty of analyses of the subject, and I'm not as knowledgeable as the people who've been studying it. But coming back to Crash Bandicoot and its game feel, the game hasn't aged well as its sequels. If you spin whilst holding one of the 4 directions, he would go into that direction at a fixed distance with no control over it, which can make for some frustration if you're on a very small platform. This also occurs when you're making jumps in succession, and he sometimes takes a few steps forward before stopping, which borrows the same lack of control when it comes to spinning whilst holding a direction briefly. The later levels make this an apparent issue, as there are times where you'd find yourself wrestling with the control slightly just to make him stay where you want him to. The sequels fix these issues completely by changing the amount of momentum given to Crash with his jumps and spin attack. This level of control carries over to the sliding move he gets given as well, enabling players to combine his slide with a well-timed jump to further increase his height and speed ever so slightly. Crash 3 increases momentum slightly from movement acting like a refined version of the first 2 games, making a happy medium of sorts. The sprint power-up makes it so that when you're going at full speed, the moment you let go of a direction, Crash comes to a near complete halt as far as I can tell. So when you have 3 games with slightly different levels of game feel, the remake has one that closely resembles between 2 and 3, which makes him feel just as responsive as he did in those games. Better yet, because this is in Crash 1 as well, the tiny platforms and boxes that you land on are much easier to perform, so levels like Sunset Vista and Native Fortress are less fiddly and can be done with more ease. Levels from the other 2 entries feel near enough the same and should be commended for accurately replicating how it feels to control, making the transition between old and new almost streamlined. The important word being almost. Even though the basic movements of jumps, spins and slides have come back feeling as good as they did back in the originals, the physics have prevented from a complete replication of Crash's moveset. The jumping arc does feel slightly different, which isn't an issue for the most part until you reach certain points where you have to land on a platform from a distance. This is where I kind of go back on my word when I said that platforming has become easier because I only notice it on particular levels. There's ways of getting around this problem by making sure you're at the closest possible distance between the moving platform, but where you have to reach to a certain place from a stationary position, you do travel less than you could in the originals. Add that to the different collision detection, and you have yourself some frustrating levels that previously required less effort to traverse. On my initial playthrough, I didn't run into any troubles until I reached Road to Nowhere, more so with the High Road as well. These are some of my favourite levels, but I think it's because I used to dread playing them when I was a child due to me dying all the time and getting my mum to do them for me. Eventually I got good at the levels and grew to appreciate the setting, mysterious music, and the rhythm you'd find yourself getting into as you bounce across the rickety planks and tortoises, avoiding rampaging warthogs. I think I may have expected too much from Vicarious Visions to replicate the physics, but these levels feel less forgiving than their original counterparts. You have to have Crash's shoes directly touch the middle of these platforms for the game to recognise that you've landed, whereas before, you could get away with touching it with Crash's toes. This comes down to the different type of hitboxes the developers went for. Instead of a box-shaped hitbox, the Sane Trilogy uses a pillbox-shaped one, which rounds off the edges, hence why you had to land on more accurately than before. If you hit the edge, you're more likely to slide off the edge and perhaps fall to your death. Combine that with the heavier jumping arc, and you have levels that were once reasonable into ones that are argued to be harder than Slippery Climb or even Stormy Ascent. This can also be very annoying when you're trying to get those gold and platinum relics, since you're having to try and platform as quickly as possible with the odds of falling off being increased even more. This issue is less prevalent in the sequels, but that's only because you have the ability to make skid jumps, which can cover a greater distance. This still makes what were once simple moves around various stages a tad more difficult to get over. What's even worse than this would be the ice physics in the snow levels of Crash 2. The moment I walked onto the first frozen section of Snow Go, I instantly noticed how wrong it felt to control Crash. It increases the weight of Crash considerably, making jumping on top of his tower of metal crates much harder than before. The lack of control you have over him skating across the ice is just as frustrating, if not more, as you practically wrestle for the controls in order to make him stop, even when you're not going at full speed. It takes longer for Crash to come to a complete halt, which can prove deadly in later levels like Cold Hard Crash, and it's not even mentioning the already tricky secret route. And that already had a shitty thing where you had to backtrack through a section just to get to the rest of the crates for the clear gem of that level. So shitty section with shitty physics, making your jumping arc and overall control considerably worse, it becomes a bit of a shitty time, and that's not to mention those movements when you're at the mercy of those pillboxes. Sure, skidding can help you out by leaping over pitfalls, but then you're instantly at full speed with near enough no chance of stopping properly, but you could try body slamming if it feels like working. This goes under my points about how it's possible to still play the game, only it might require you to do some faffing about with the controls in a bid to make things work. From what I can find on various forum posts regarding this issue, people have found not only do the platforms have these hitboxes, but also Crash and Coco as well. There is some advantage to take from this, however. You can run at full speed and jump off the platform practically in mid-air in the space for a few frames. But the cons outweigh the pros, however, since this affects the entirety of the trilogy from the pitfalls to the enemies. So if you've ever wondered why you sometimes slide off the side of the upturned tortoise when jumping on it, that's the pillbox. It doesn't ruin the game for me, but it certainly makes it feel close to perfection, but just narrowly misses it in the control department. Some might say this offers a new challenge to players who are very familiar with the PlayStation classics, and once you learn how these new rules work, it more or less becomes less noticeable. And at times I can agree with that on a casual playthrough when you're just taking your time and getting the crystals, but there's always that nagging feeling in the back of my head when I come across trickier parts of the games. Of course, you're not going to be controlling just Crash and Coco during your time here. The sequels mix things up by giving the player the opportunity to commandeer a variety of vehicles, most notably in Crash Warped. Like them or hate them, they certainly added a variety to the latter part of the trilogy and brings in some cool settings as well. There are definitely ones I prefer over others, but on the whole I've always liked this shake-up to the platforming formula, be it a section where you control something briefly, or levels that are dedicated to a certain type of transport. The hog levels in Crash 1 felt like a proof of concept of the animal auto-scrolling levels that would later appear in 2 and 3, since the controls felt restrictive and ended up becoming trial and error rather than a test of skill. The remake improves the level of control rather well, making the hog level feel like it's turning slightly faster than you could back in '96. Even though players have found some weird glitches when bouncing off these drums, I fortunately never did, and overall it felt more fun rather than going in with a deep breath and hoping you don't die. Again, thanks to the better way of getting to gems like you could in the other two, you no longer have to do a deathless run. So you would expect a similar story with Hogwild's successors, but sadly this isn't the case. Polar Emperor had some of the best levels on the PlayStation with a zoomed out view so you can see more, varied obstacles to avoid, and overall better level design. All of that is back here of course, but something doesn't feel right, and I don't know if it's just me, but whenever I played the Polar levels, it feels as though he turns very quickly and jumps even further than before. This wouldn't be too much of a problem had they just built this level around these new controls, because everything in the levels are the same distance as their original iterations. My guess is that Vicarious Visions made the levels first, since they had the original geometry to use, and then implement the characters with their engine. That probably sounds like a load of crap, and you're probably right. I'm not a game designer, but that's what it feels like to me. They haven't adjusted Polar's speed enough to work around these levels, and it makes for some haphazard platforming. Again, this can land under the argument of a new challenge for experienced players of the game, but I don't quite buy it with this example. It's just weird. You can probably get used to it after a while, but I simply can't. The Polar levels in Crash 3 suffer less since he has a slower average speed, but the jumping still feels a bit off to me, and the hit detection from certain obstacles can leave much to be desired. There isn't much to say about the motorised surfboard or the submergible, as they behave a lot like how they did in the originals. It's also worth noting that Crash and his scuba gear don't feel any different either. You can still tap X to go faster, and do a slight speed boost whilst using the mini sub, as well as firing torpedoes. I was never a big fan of the plane levels since they felt like filler rather than an actual level. You can easily beat them in just over a minute, and it isn't any different here. Maybe the crosshair is improved or the barrel roll is more effective, but I never notice anything. They're pretty throwaway levels if you ask me. The only time I actually spent some proper time with the plane is with my absolute favourite level in the entire series, Rings of Power. I didn't even know you could make tight turns until I played the remake. Kinda shows how little I took any notice of the planes. They felt slow and boring back then, and they still feel slow and boring now. The jetpack is anything but slow and boring, and I know some people really don't like these levels, but to me, the jetpack controls like a dream once you get the hang of it. I absolutely hated these levels as a child, but just like the bridge levels in Crash 1, I've grown a huge appreciation towards them, and wish there were more than just 2 of these levels. The inverted controls take some getting used to, but once mastered, Crash feels buttery smooth to fly through the space station, avoiding lasers and nitro crates. Vicarious Visions did a tremendous job at replicating that sensation. From the visuals to the music, the jetpack levels are among the biggest highlights of this remake. It's funny to think that even though Crash and his animal companions feel different for better or for worse, the majority of the vehicles feel pretty much the same, showing that the Sane Trilogy does have some faithfully remade levels. It certainly would have been interested if they had actually made the controls better for vehicles such as the motorcycle, since it still feels incredibly stiff to turn, and even more once you drive over a speed booster. But I like that they suddenly garner attention to the alien sign in Road Crash, which leads to one of the secret levels. Which brings me to the last of the vehicles, the jet ski, and it's a bit of a mixed bag. On one hand, there is a slight difference in weight when turning, but it's nothing to get worked up about. You might not notice any change at all, and I'm probably imagining it myself, but one thing that certainly sticks out more like a sore thumb are the physics to the ramps. It's hard to describe, but in Crash 3, once you go over a ramp, you're practically propelled in a single direction, straight up the middle and hit whatever crates may be up there. It almost locks you in place when you're going at full speed. The remake doesn't have this handy little feature, as it will propel you in whichever direction you're going at, meaning if you misjudge your angle from slightly off centre, Coco is likely to be launched either to the left or to the right. Not only that, but when you slow down and try and turn around, it somehow feels even worse due to its wider turning circle, meaning the painfully intense hot Coco has now become even more of a dreaded visit than before, especially when you're going for a gold or platinum relic in time trial mode. Or better yet, just do what I did and take advantage of the crappy hit detection and explode the bombs, blocking the exit with the end of the jet ski. Have it, mate. Have it. Music has been completely redone, offering either a faithful rendition or a different interpretation to the original soundtracks. The Bandicoot scores aren't exactly memorable or as highly regarded as other soundtracks of that time, but if you were like me and played them endlessly back when they came out, then you'll know how overlooked these scores really are. I always loved the majorly comical tones that came from the original 3, suitably using a wide variety of different sounds and instruments to fit in with the level's themes. That's not to say all of these tracks were all fun and games, since some take things in the opposite direction by creating an atmosphere emphasising on the later level's uninviting presence. If I were to briefly describe each of the soundtracks, I would say that Crash 1 is the most linear in terms of tone, as it starts off with a light-hearted approach with native sounding instruments, but as you get closer to Cortex, the soundtrack becomes more mechanical and electronic. This also mirrors the linearity of the overall structure of the first game, bar a few hidden levels here and there. Crash 2 loosens things up a bit by having new themes added into the mix, including surf rock influences, a wintry theme, and being knee-deep in the sewers, to name a few. It doesn't follow the linear structure like the previous entry did, instead it introduces more variety to its settings and mixes them up. Crash 3 follows this formula, but this time ushers in historically based themes like 1950s rock and roll, fantasy medieval tracks, and futuristic synth. Basically a time-travelling machine full of Bandicoot medleys. It's certainly interesting to hear a series of soundtracks I've heard countless times to be reimagined all these years later, and as such, there are some favourites whilst others fall flat on their face in execution. One thing that can't be stressed enough though when talking about these soundtracks is that these are not enhanced or remastered versions of the original tracks. Just like the games, the soundtracks are essentially covers done in-house at Vicarious Visions. It's unclear as to why Activision didn't hire Josh Mansell, the original composer of the trilogy and Crash Team Racing, for if not to use the original mixes, but for overseeing how these soundtracks would be redone and making suggestions what works and what doesn't. This is the sole reason why the original soundtrack isn't available on here, since Mansell owns all the pre-console mixes, which some you can listen to over on his SoundCloud page. But I did take the time to put the original music with the Sane Trilogy if you are ever curious of what that may have sounded like had Mansell been involved on the project. I imagine it would have been cheaper to do it in-house rather than hire a freelancer, since Activision didn't have as much faith in the project as most would have liked. Maybe it came down to budgeting reasons, but some of the tracks does have that cheap stock kind of sound. The standard drum kit that you can hear in the likes of Upstream or Torna's Bonus Round, it sounds like a drum loop you would find on GarageBand, and the same goes for other instruments used throughout the soundtracks. There's always an element here and there that takes me out of the vibe that they were going for. I could very well be wrong, but something about the quality of production makes it sound artificial and lacks this sense of authenticity. One thing I did like was that in a number of tracks like Heavy Machinery, you can hear a few samples from the original games, making a callback, which are really nice touches. A number of tracks work particularly well, some of which enhance the overall experience. A great example of this can be heard in the Arabian levels in Crash 3, and how it uses realistic instruments that I imagine Josh Mansell was trying to imitate originally. The added bits of percussion and strings really bring out the majestic aura of the Middle East under the sweltering heat. It's still one of my favourite tracks in the original trilogy and the remake. It's absolutely gorgeous. This can also be referred to the majestic brass played in the medieval levels, making a far grander impression, as if you're setting out on a mythical quest of heroic proportions. It's certainly one of my favourite revised tracks, as it feels like they've taken every element from the original and simply beefed them up with more accurate sounding instruments. Or how about one of the best revisions courtesy of the surf rock injected theme for Crash 2, perfectly capturing the essence of the original track, throwing in some added drama from sustained chords of an organ and punchier drums that don't sound as insincere as ones that I've mentioned earlier. But where we get some brilliant renditions making it feel rejuvenated and fresh for a new generation, there are nearly just as many that feature some questionable changes that either end up bringing an alternative flavour to the ears, or at worst, change the tone of a level in a negative way. The chase theme featured in Crash Dash and Unbearable builds on the foundation that the Boulder levels made in the first game and increase its weight in tension and drama, using bombastic drums that grabs your attention with a horn echoing in the distance as if you're being hunted down, followed by a runaway melody that raises the stakes as you pursue to outrun the incoming danger from behind. The remake soundtrack fails to meet any of these criteria, which is a shame since it's one of Crash 2's most memorable tracks. What we get here instead is this distortive synth played throughout, and although the major hits of the drums make an appearance, they are turned down way too low to make an impact comparable with the originals. The only thing I like here is the melody towards the end of a loop with accompanied strings and added percussion, but because of a lack of urgency in the first half, this bit doesn't quite reach the same levels as what the original did. Intentional or not, but the use of futuristic synths and weird oscillating sounds can be heard throughout the soundtrack in Crash 2. This could be to bring in a subtle musical theme to levels in a bid to unite them in some way, since you can access these levels via teleportation in the warp room. Perhaps the sci-fi element permits the use of these out-of-place instruments. That isn't to say it doesn't work anywhere at all. The later segments like Spaced Out provide some logic to its placement, but more often than it did I find it sounding very out of place. Bear It, Crash Crush, the Eel Deal, and Ripperoo's Fight all feature some form of high-tech synth that didn't feel right with me. It tended to mess up the level's own theme to make room for these strange inclusions. Electric guitars makes its appearance well known throughout the trilogy, not just making its stay in Cortex Strikes Back. I don't mind it much in some levels, but its use in some levels certainly give it some kick and actual weight that has been missing in so many of their other tracks. I particularly liked Dingo Dar's theme. It certainly helped the fight feel more intense as he tried to outmaneuver his radioactive blasts. Or when you're going down the corridors of toxic waste, which was a theme I didn't like at first, but upon multiple playthroughs, it definitely grew on me. music for Generator Room carries a lighter approach, involving a small jingle that sounds like something used as a phone alarm, but it does retain some elements from the original track, like the pulsation of sine waves and the occasional crash symbol, but it feels too much of a departure from the atmospheric and spooky ambience of Crash 1 to me. And that's the thing, even though there are lots of changes to the soundtracks, sometimes making a lighter atmosphere for its levels, it does reflect on the brighter presentation that this remake has. In my videos where I took the original tracks and placed them over footage of the Sane Trilogy, there were some that didn't quite go with the look of the games to me. Granted, the majority of the music did make things feel a little bit better, but had the developers darkened certain levels like Generator Room and Road to Ruin, I think they would have improved this dynamic even further. I still prefer the old music over this remake, but I can definitely see why some would opt for the newer soundtracks. Whilst the original soundtracks might not be as memorable or groundbreaking as other games to some people, as a fan of the PlayStation platformers, they play their part for setting the mood for every level, and whilst the remixes are certainly serviceable and get the job done to many people, for somebody who's grown up with these games, I'm sure you can understand my reservations for some of the changes that were made. Whilst in the middle of writing the script, I did have a section talking about my criticisms on the load times, but thanks to this update coinciding with the multi-platform release, it's near enough redundant. I had a lengthy load time from booting up the game to get to one of the titles, and this was exacerbated whenever you wanted to go for the colour gems of Crash 1, where you'd have to quit the level once you died and immediately go back in only to wait for a moment before retrying. That may sound like a minor thing, but it does tend to grind on you when you continue to come back for more, but like I said, that isn't an issue anymore. You can even skip the introductory cutscene, which again, minor, but such a nice quality of life change for me. Hints are on the bottom of the screen that offers helpful advice to players who may not be familiar with the games, which is a feature I quite like, although some are a little bit redundant and perhaps hinder the experimental side to what the originals offers, like in levels with hidden routes in sewer later and behaving. But because they are there for such a little time, it's hard to even read what it says before you're in that level, funnily enough. A couple of levels were later added to the game, including a finished version of Stormy Ascent, a level that didn't make the cut at the last minute before Crash Bandicoot was released, which is essentially a harder version of Slippery Climb, as if that wasn't hard enough. It has more elaborate obstacles first introduced by its sibling, and it even makes you descend a level at some point. It certainly challenges players, even those who haven't played the unfinished version, so for me, this was the first time I got to experience with this notorious level, and although I died many times to it, that's part of the fun, being taken back by the next thing this level will present to you before making an attempt and perhaps dying in a funny fashion. This sentiment carries over to the second level released several months later, not only for it to be additional to Crash 3's portion of the collection, but also being a completely original level, making it the first traditional Crash level made in 17 years. Acting as an extra hard variant on the futuristic theme in Crash 3, Future Tense throws in new challenges and introduces some inventive placement of platforms and obstacles that made me wish there were more of these super hard levels in the games. I can imagine there would be a final installment to each setting acting as a culmination of everything that's been seen, but also offers some interesting ideas that we haven't seen before. There's a level of care and attention to the already established cues of making a Crash level. There's an amount of things hiding away from the player, encouraging them to think outside the box if they want to get the 2 gems. Stuff like going back on yourself at the start, which we've seen in the High Road and Sphinxinator to break vital crates, jumping over the first elevator, or even dropping down a pitfall with no indication of anything underneath, is sly, but also very enriching in terms of playability. And it's not as if these moments are ridiculously hidden. Each of these instances does require some cunning or a good eye to tell where the last few crates lie. The fun part about it is when you reach the end and realise how many crates you didn't find, where are they? Try again, but this time taking extra care for where to go next. The platforming elements have some very novel ideas, like the spinny platforms placed underneath some TNT crates and the big Ed 209s blasting out a reflective window, forcing you to avoid their incoming missiles. And I love how in the last part of Future Tense it becomes a slight homage to a scrapped waterfall level from Crash 1, which feature these rotating platforms and have you ascending your way up towards the exit. These ideas and more are strewn throughout the level, more so with the highly enjoyable death route, where the difficulty is cranked up a notch by having TNT crates as platforms, the spinny platforms placed to put you in harm's way of incoming missiles, and generally tricky obstacles that will make you perform a manner of various moves. All of this and somehow the physics and hit detection didn't get in the way of how much fun I had with future tense, but I think that's because this is a brand new level built around the engine they've used, so all of the problems that I've encountered during my time with the remakes are nowhere to be seen. It's a brilliant level that had me laughing at times when I died, and points where I had to backtrack in order to get the last remaining crates. As a seasoned player to this series, this is definitely a must play for anyone who's had experience with the PlayStation classics. I have noticed when this came out, people have been speculating or asking for a remake of Crash Team Racing amongst the others requesting a Spyro remake, and I can get why people would want a modern version of one of the best mascot races around, but through my experience with the Insane Trilogy, I'd be very skeptical about it until I play it for myself. Rose-tinted glasses aside, Crash Team Racing is regarded as one of the best mascot races around due to an extensive cast of characters to choose from, a brilliant soundtrack that stands alongside the main series, and a skill-based drifting turbo system that I haven't seen in any other racer. I wouldn't have any trouble with the designs of the characters if they made the same ones that appeared in the remake, or better yet, add some of the other characters like Koala Kong and Komodo Mo, and perhaps even make Nitrous Oxide finally playable. Or make a few new tracks that reflect some of the level themes that weren't touched in CTR, like a Hang 8 type of track, or a historical setting from Crash 3. My only concern would be a point I made earlier on in the video about their new physics being slapped onto the original geometry of the tracks, making jumps potentially heavier and the handling of the carts feeling tighter than they did. Unless they redesigned the tracks around their physics engine first so that it would make pulling off tricks like it could in the original easier, then I wouldn't hold my breath if similar issues occur with the feel of the game, the same way many, like myself, have experienced with the Insane Trilogy. If I were to rank the original trilogy, it would be a close call between 2 and 3, but 2 taking the title since it has more levels and less of what I consider filler, and Crash 1 at third, not because it's a bad game, but rather how much improvement its 2 sequels received in the following years, outranking the first instantly. The order for the remakes are completely different, with Crash 1 meeting itself in the middle due to the overall improvement on saving whenever you can, making completing it a bit easier in a similar vein to the sequels, whilst retaining the challenge in the colour gems. Certain levels may be more difficult courtesy to its collision and heavier jump arc. It is still an okay platformer that can every now and then make you want to pull your hair out when those problems stand out, especially during the time trials. The one that suffers the least in my opinion is easily Crash 3, since the majority of vehicles don't feel any different, even though some would have benefited better controls. It's also the one where I ran into the least amount of issues with the remake's hit detection, and it has the best redone soundtrack overall. Add that to the deviously future tense, it's worth trying out the Insane Trilogy just for that level alone for any old school fans. Crash 2 was just disappointing and slightly depressing to play through at times, since so much that made the original so good has been replaced by altered controls, the screwed up ice physics making the snow levels unbearable to play, and the weakest soundtrack which at times completely changed the general vibe of some levels. The only parts I liked were the jetpack levels, some levels in the early game, and the time trial mode which offered some replayability, but in comparison to the 1997 release, there's no doubt that it overshadows the efforts by Vicarious Visions. I believe it's important and encouraging for the series to be granted a remake, introducing new audiences to these games, as well as offering a nostalgic trip for those who haven't played them since their initial release. Despite its shortcomings, I would still recommend it solely to experience the first game in a more player-friendly environment, and the additional levels that were included later on. It's not quite good enough to replace Cortex Strikes Back or Warped, since those two games have aged really well, but in the dream scenario of mine, there would be a modified version of Crash 1 with the quality of life features included from its remake, since the original's visuals and music have their own quirky charm. I don't at all despise the Insane Trilogy through the majority of visual changes or renditions of the game's music. It looks as though that whatever they got right or improved on to make it a cohesive package, they've stumbled on other aspects enough that it can't be recommended as the definitive version of the trilogy. It's not awful by any means, the inclusion of a finished version of Stormy Ascent and a brand new level does make it worth having a go, and the attention to detail from the backgrounds to the subtle things that happen in the original games does show that Vicarious Visions did their absolute best at bringing back the orange marsupial to the 21st century. Perhaps in an ideal world, they would have been given more time to work on the collision and jumping arcs, but the Insane Trilogy is the most convenient way of experiencing this legendary trio of platformers that, thanks to its success, has rekindled interest in these games. And perhaps we may very well see a completely new Crash game in the future, and not just let it be a single remake cashing in on people's nostalgia. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you all next time.